In the autumn of 1918, the German government sent a formal warning to the United States military. It said that if American soldiers were captured carrying one particular weapon, they would not be treated as prisoners of war under the normal rules. Instead, they would be executed on the spot as war criminals. This was not a machine gun. It was not poison gas. It was not a flamethrower. It was a shotgun. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why one simple pump-action weapon terrified an entire army enough to demand it be banned from the battlefield. Welcome back to WW2 Hero Cypher, the channel where we dig into the real stories behind the weapons, the soldiers, and the decisions that shaped the outcome of the two world wars. If you are new here, we tell these stories using documented history, military records, and first-hand accounts, and we try to bring you the truth without the exaggeration that so much online content adds for clicks. Today, we are looking at a weapon that started its life as a hunting gun. It ended up so effective in close-quarters combat that an entire nation tried to have it declared illegal, and then went on to terrify soldiers in the jungles of the Pacific 2 decades later. Stick with us, because the story of the Winchester Model 1897, known to soldiers as the trench gun, is one of the strangest and most overlooked chapters of both world wars. Before we go further, I want you to think about something. When most people picture a controversial or banned weapon from history, they think of chemical weapons, exploding bullets, or landmines. They do not think of a shotgun that you could buy at a hardware store. Yet this ordinary-looking firearm became so effective at killing that a major world power tried to have international law changed specifically to stop American troops from using it. Keep that thought in your head because we are going to come back to it in a few minutes when we explain exactly what Germany claimed and how the United States responded. To understand why this weapon became such a problem, we need to go back to the trenches of the First World War. By 1917, when American forces began arriving in France in large numbers, the war on the Western Front had settled into a brutal pattern. Long lines of trenches stretched across the landscape, protected by barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a stretch of churned-up earth where nothing much could survive for long. The fighting in this environment was nothing like open battlefield warfare. Soldiers often found themselves fighting at extremely close range, sometimes just a few meters apart, inside narrow trench systems. Dugouts and captured enemy positions during raids. In this kind of fighting, a rifle was often not the ideal weapon. Bolt-action rifles like the American Springfield or the German Mauser were accurate and powerful over long distances. But they were slow to reload and difficult to manage in a cramped, twisting trench where an enemy soldier could appear from around a corner just a meter or two away. Pistols were faster to use in tight spaces, but lacked stopping power and range. What soldiers needed was something that combined speed, close-range power, and reliability. This is where the Winchester Model 1897 came in. The Model 1897 was not originally designed for war at all. It was a civilian shotgun, developed by the famous firearms designer John Browning, and produced by Winchester for hunters and sport shooters. It was a pump-action weapon, meaning the shooter worked a sliding handguard back and forth to eject a spent shell and load a new one. It fired 12-gauge shotgun shells, which typically contained multiple lead pellets, known as buckshot rather than a single bullet. When the American military looked at the weapons available for trench combat, someone realized that this ordinary hunting shotgun, with a few modifications, could become one of the most effective close-quarters weapons available. The military version was fitted with a shortened barrel, a bayonet lug so that a standard army bayonet could be attached to the end, sling swivels for carrying it more easily, and a distinctive perforated steel heat shield wrapped around the barrel to stop the wooden handguard from catching fire during rapid firing. This modified weapon became known as the trench gun, and it was issued to American soldiers heading into the trenches of France. What made it so devastating was not just the weapon itself, but a quirk in its mechanical design. The Model 1897 did not have a disconnector, which is the small mechanical part in most modern firearms that requires the trigger to be released and pulled again before each shot, because the Model 1897 lacked this part. A soldier could hold the trigger down and simply pump the action back and forth, and the gun would fire with each pump cycle. This technique became known as slam firing, and it allowed a soldier to unleash 5 shells in just a couple of seconds. each one spraying multiple pellets of buckshot into anyone unlucky enough to be in front of the barrel. In the confined space of a trench, a dugout, or a captured bunker, this was absolutely devastating. A single blast from the trench gun could incapacitate multiple enemy soldiers standing close together, something a rifle simply could not do. During trench raids, where small groups of soldiers would sneak into enemy positions at night to capture prisoners or destroy equipment, the trench gun quickly earned a fearsome reputation among the men who carried it, and more importantly, among the German soldiers who found themselves on the receiving end of it. Word began to spread through German lines about this weapon that American soldiers were using. Reports describe soldiers being hit with dozens of pellets at once, wounds unlike anything caused by a standard rifle bullet, and the sheer speed at which American units could clear a stretch of trench using slam fire technique. It did not take long before this reputation reached the highest levels of the German military and government. And what happened next turned an ordinary hunting shotgun into the center of an international diplomatic dispute that still gets discussed by military historians today. By the summer of 1918, reports of the American trench gun had become impossible for the German high command to ignore. Soldiers returning from raids and prisoners of war described a weapon that could tear through multiple men in a single blast, at a rate of fire far beyond anything a standard rifle could manage. In close-quarters trench fighting, where survival often came down to who could fire first and who could fire the most rounds in the shortest time, the shotgun gave American troops a serious advantage, and the German military establishment took notice. What made this situation different from most weapons disputes of the war was the specific legal argument the Germans decided to use. Rather than simply complaining about the effectiveness of the weapon, the German government formally invoked the laws of war that had been established at the Hague Peace Conferences in 1899 and 1907. These international agreements had been signed by many nations, including the United States and Germany. They set out rules for how wars should be conducted, including restrictions on weapons that were considered to cause unnecessary suffering. One of the most well-known parts of these agreements was a declaration banning the use of expanding bullets, sometimes called dum-dum bullets, because they were designed to deform on impact and cause much larger wounds than a standard bullet. Germany argued that the shotgun, firing multiple pellets of buckshot that spread out and caused numerous separate wounds across a victim's body, violated the same principle behind the ban on expanding bullets. Their argument was that a soldier hit by buckshot would suffer wounds that were excessive and unnecessarily cruel compared to being struck by a single rifle bullet, and that this made the trench gun a violation of the accepted rules of warfare. Based on this argument, the German government sent a formal diplomatic protest to the United States government in 1918. And this protest reportedly went further than simply asking for the weapon to be withdrawn. According to historical accounts documented by firearms historians who have studied the surviving military and diplomatic records, the German note stated that any American soldier captured while carrying a shotgun or shotgun ammunition would be treated as having committed a war crime, and could face execution rather than being held as a standard prisoner of war. This was an extraordinarily serious threat. If you think about what this meant for the individual soldier, it changed the entire risk of carrying this particular weapon into battle. A rifleman captured by the enemy could expect to be treated according to the accepted rules of the time and held in a prisoner of war camp until the end of the conflict. A soldier, captured with a trench gun according to this German position, might not receive that same protection at all. This put enormous pressure on the American military and government to respond quickly, because soldiers were still being issued these weapons and sent into combat while this diplomatic argument was unfolding. Now here's where I want to pause for a moment, because I think it is worth reflecting on just how unusual this entire situation was. This was not a debate about a chemical weapon or an experimental device built specifically to cause mass casualties. This was a modification of a hunting shotgun that any farmer or sportsman in America might have owned before the war. The idea that owning and using what was essentially a civilian firearm could be treated as grounds for execution shows just how effective this weapon had proven itself to be in the brutal reality of trench warfare. It also tells us something important about how nations at war try to use international law and diplomacy as another battlefield, fighting not just with weapons but with legal arguments designed to strip an opponent of an advantage. The United States government and military legal experts did not simply accept the German position. The War Department and the State Department reviewed the German protest carefully and ultimately rejected it entirely. Their argument rested on a fairly straightforward legal distinction. The Hague Declaration concerning expanding bullets specifically addressed bullets fired from rifles and pistols that were designed to expand or flatten upon striking a target, causing wounds far beyond what a normal bullet would cause. Shotguns and buckshot ammunition were an entirely different and long-established category of weapon that had existed for hunting and sport shooting for well over a century before the war even began. The pellets fired by a shotgun did not expand or deform in the way that a dum-dum bullet did, and shotguns had never been included in any previous international agreement or declaration restricting weapons of war. American officials also pointed out that many other weapons used throughout the war, including artillery shells, high-explosive grenades, and machine guns, caused far more devastating wounds than a shotgun ever could. Yet none of these had been challenged under the same reasoning. The United States' position was that Germany's protest was not really about the legal status of the weapon under international law, rather about the fact that American forces had found an effective countermeasure to German trench tactics, and Germany wanted that advantage removed through diplomatic pressure rather than admitting it was simply losing ground in close-quarters combat. Despite the German threat, the American military did not withdraw the trench gun from service. Soldiers continued to carry it into combat for the remainder of the war, and it continued to be used in trench raids right up until the armistice was signed in November 1918. There is no confirmed historical record of any American soldier actually being executed specifically for carrying a shotgun. And the German threat, while alarming, appears to have functioned more as a diplomatic and psychological pressure tactic than something that was ever fully carried out in practice. Nevertheless, the controversy cemented the trench gun's reputation as one of the most feared and most talked about weapons of the entire war. And it is a genuinely fascinating example of how a relatively simple weapon can end up at the center of a major international legal dispute. What is perhaps even more interesting is what happened to this weapon after the First World War ended, rather than being retired or forgotten, as so many wartime weapons were. The trench gun and its underlying design would go on to serve American forces again, just over 2 decades later, in a completely different theater of war, against a completely different enemy, in conditions that, in some ways, were even more suited to its strengths than the trenches of France had been. When the First World War ended in November 1918, military planners around the world began the process of reviewing what had worked and what had not during 4 years of brutal, industrialized conflict. The trench gun controversy did not disappear once the fighting stopped. Military historians and legal scholars continued to reference the German protest for years afterwards, using it as a case study in how the laws of war could be interpreted and challenged by nations looking for any advantage over their opponents. The United States military, for its part, retained the Model 1897 and similar shotguns in its arsenal, recognizing that despite the controversy, the weapon had proven itself extremely effective in exactly the kind of close-quarters fighting that modern warfare increasingly demanded. During the years between the 2 world wars, military doctrine around the world shifted significantly. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry became the focus of most major powers, and the static trench warfare of the previous conflict was widely assumed to be a thing of the past. Because of this, weapons specifically designed for close-quarters trench combat, including the shotgun, received relatively little attention from military planners during this period. It would take the outbreak of a new global conflict, and specifically the unique demands of fighting in the Pacific, to bring the combat shotgun back into serious use. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941 following the attack on Pearl Harbor, American forces soon found themselves fighting in an environment that was, in many ways, even more suited to close-quarters weapons than the trenches of France had been. The Pacific Campaign against Japan involved fighting across dense jungle terrain, through networks of caves and against fortified bunker systems built into hillsides and coral ridges on islands across the Pacific. In this kind of environment, visibility was often extremely limited. Thick vegetation, darkness, inside caves and tunnels, and the close range at which Japanese defenders often engaged American troops meant that the same problems soldiers faced in the trenches of 1918 reappeared, just in a completely different setting. Military planners in the United States recognized this quickly, and shotguns were once again issued to American forces. this time primarily to Marines and soldiers fighting in the Pacific theater. The Winchester Model 1897 continued to see limited use, alongside other combat shotguns of the era, including the Winchester Model 12 and the Stevens and Savage Model 620, all of which were built along similar lines and modified for military service with heat shields, bayonet lugs, and extended magazine tubes to hold more shells. These weapons were collectively referred to by troops simply as trench guns, a name that had carried over directly from the previous war. Even though the modern versions were being used in jungles and coral caves rather than the muddy trenches of France, the reasons these shotguns proved so useful in the Pacific were very similar to the reasons they had proven useful in the First World War. But the specific tactical situations were often even more extreme. American forces frequently had to clear Japanese soldiers out of bunkers, caves, and tunnel systems that honeycombed islands such as Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. These structures were often pitch dark, extremely cramped, defended by soldiers who were prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender. In this kind of fighting, engagements often took place at ranges of just a few meters, sometimes less, and often happened so suddenly that there was no time to aim carefully or fire more than a single shot. A shotgun loaded with buckshot was extremely well suited to this kind of combat, unlike a rifle, which relies on precise aim to place a single bullet on target. A shotgun spreads multiple pellets across a wider area with each shot, which meant that even in poor visibility or during a sudden close-range encounter, a soldier carrying a shotgun had a much higher chance of hitting an enemy combatant compared to someone carrying a standard rifle. This made shotguns particularly popular among soldiers assigned to clear bunkers, tunnels, and dense jungle areas where the enemy could appear from any direction with little or no warning. Accounts from Marines and soldiers who served in the Pacific described the shotgun as one of the most trusted weapons for this specific kind of fighting. While it is difficult to verify precise statistics about exactly how many engagements were decided by shotguns compared to other weapons, contemporary accounts and later historical studies of the Pacific Campaign consistently mention shotguns being issued specifically for jungle patrols, tunnel clearing operations, and perimeter guard duty at night, when the chance of close-range surprise contact with enemy infiltrators was highest. Some historical accounts also describe Japanese prisoners and soldiers expressing particular fear of the shotgun compared to standard rifles. Due to the devastating effect of buckshot at close range and the psychological impact of facing a weapon that could hit multiple points on the body with a single trigger pull, it is important to note that these accounts come from wartime reports and post-war interviews rather than precise documented statistics, and should be understood as part of the broader historical record of how the weapon was perceived, rather than as an exact measurable claim. What is very well documented, however, is that the combat shotgun remained a standard-issue weapon for specific roles within the United States military throughout the entire war in the Pacific, and its usefulness in this particular type of warfare helped cement its place in American military history for decades to come. The very same design principles that had made the Model 1897 so controversial in the trenches of France in 1918, a weapon capable of devastating close-range firepower with minimal need for precise aiming, were turned out to be exactly what was needed in the jungles and caves of the Pacific just over 20 years later. It is worth pausing here to think about the irony of this entire story. A weapon that one nation tried to have banned as a war crime, arguing that it caused unnecessary suffering and violated the accepted rules of warfare, ended up being used again by the same country roughly 2 decades later in a completely different war against a completely different enemy, and once again proved to be one of the most valuable tools available to soldiers fighting in brutal close-quarters conditions. The debate over whether the shotgun was an illegitimate weapon of war never really returned during the Second World War. By that point, the legal argument Germany had raised in 1918 had already been firmly rejected, and the weapon had earned its place as an accepted and valuable part of the American military arsenal. Let us take a closer look at some of the specific conditions and campaigns in the Pacific where the combat shotgun proved its worth, because understanding the details helps explain exactly why this weapon, once considered controversial enough to spark an international diplomatic dispute, became such a trusted tool for American forces fighting against Japan. The island of Guadalcanal, where American Marines landed in August 1942, marked one of the first major American offensive operations of the Pacific War. The fighting here took place across dense tropical jungle, where visibility was often reduced to just a few meters in any direction. Japanese forces used this terrain to their advantage, often allowing American patrols to pass close by before launching sudden ambushes at extremely short range. In this kind of fighting, the ability to fire quickly and hit a target without needing precise aim was far more valuable than the long-range accuracy of a standard rifle. Marines who carried shotguns during jungle patrols found them particularly effective in these sudden, close-range encounters, where there was often no time to properly aim a rifle before an enemy soldier was already within a few meters. As the war progressed and American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the nature of the fighting changed. Rather than facing open jungle ambushes, American troops increasingly found themselves attacking heavily fortified Japanese positions built into caves, ridgelines, and underground bunker systems. The Battle for Peleliu in 1944 became infamous for exactly this kind of fighting. Japanese defenders had constructed an extensive network of caves and tunnels throughout the coral ridges of the island. And rather than meeting American forces on open ground, they chose to fight from these fortified positions, forcing American troops to clear each cave and tunnel individually, often in complete darkness and at extremely close range. This type of combat, sometimes referred to by historians as cave clearing or bunker clearing operations, was some of the most dangerous and psychologically demanding fighting. Of the entire Pacific War, soldiers had to enter confined spaces where they could not see more than a meter or two ahead, knowing that an enemy soldier could be waiting just around the next bend in the tunnel. In these conditions, the combat shotgun once again proved extremely valuable. Its ability to hit a target without precise aim, combined with the devastating effect of multiple buckshot pellets at close range, made it a preferred weapon for many of the soldiers tasked with this incredibly dangerous work. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 saw similar conditions, with Japanese forces once again relying heavily on underground fortifications, tunnels, and cave systems to defend their positions. By this stage of the war, American military planners had a great deal of experience with this type of fighting, and shotguns continued to be issued specifically for units expected to encounter this kind of close-quarters combat, alongside other specialized equipment such as flamethrowers, which were also particularly effective against fortified cave and bunker positions. It is also worth mentioning that shotguns were valued for another important role throughout the Pacific Campaign, which was perimeter defense during the night. Japanese forces frequently attempted infiltration raids after dark, sometimes involving small groups of soldiers attempting to sneak through American lines to attack rear areas, supply depots, or artillery positions. In the darkness, visibility extremely limited, and encounters often happening at very close range with little warning, sentries armed with shotguns had a significant advantage over those carrying standard rifles, simply because the spread of buckshot made it far more likely that a sudden shot in the dark would actually hit an approaching enemy soldier. Historical records from the United States Marine Corps and the wider United States military confirm that shotguns remained part of the standard equipment used throughout the Pacific Campaign for these specific roles, right through until the end of the war in August 1945. While shotguns were never issued as the primary weapon for the majority of infantry soldiers, who continued to rely mainly on rifles such as the M1 Garand, they occupied an important and specialized role for particular units and particular types of combat, where their unique strengths, close-range stopping power, and forgiving accuracy requirements made them more effective than any other weapon available at the time. Thinking back to the controversy of 1918, it is remarkable how completely the shotgun's reputation had shifted by the time the Second World War came to an end. What Germany had once argued was an illegal and unnecessarily cruel weapon had become, just over 2 decades later, a trusted and valued piece of equipment relied upon by American forces in some of the most dangerous combat conditions of the entire war. No formal international objection to the use of shotguns arose during the Second World War in the way it had during the First. The legal and diplomatic argument had already been settled, and by 1945 the combat shotgun was simply viewed as one of many legitimate tools available to modern infantry forces, suited to a particular set of combat conditions, just as rifles, machine guns, and grenades were suited to others. This entire story raises an interesting question about how the rules of war are decided and who gets to decide them. In 1918, a weapon's fate very nearly rested on a diplomatic argument between two nations at war. With Germany attempting to use international law as a tool to remove an American advantage on the battlefield, the United States successfully argued that the shotgun did not fall under the existing rules established at the Hague conferences. And this decision effectively settled the matter for the rest of the 20th century. Had the outcome of that diplomatic dispute gone differently, it is entirely possible that combat shotguns would never have been available to American forces fighting in the Pacific just over 2 decades later, and the outcome of individual battles in places like Peleliu and Okinawa might have unfolded quite differently as a result. As we bring this story to a close, I think it is worth reflecting on what the story of the trench gun actually tells us about the nature of warfare, technology, and the rules that are supposed to govern how wars are fought. A weapon that began its life as an ordinary hunting shotgun, sold to farmers and sportsmen across America, ended up at the center of an international diplomatic dispute, so serious that soldiers were warned they might face execution simply for carrying it into battle. That same weapon went on to serve American forces again, more than 2 decades later, in an entirely different war, against an entirely different enemy, proving just as valuable in the jungles and caves of the Pacific as it had been in the trenches of France. This story also highlights something important about how the laws of war actually work in practice. These rules are not fixed forever. They're shaped by negotiation, argument, and the specific interests of the nations involved at any given moment. Germany's attempt to have the shotgun classified as an illegal weapon in 1918 was, in many ways, a strategic move designed to remove an advantage from its opponent, and the United States' response was equally strategic, defending its right to use an effective weapon by pointing to the precise legal wording of existing agreements. Neither side was purely acting out of abstract concern for the suffering of soldiers. Both were fighting to protect or remove a battlefield advantage, using diplomacy and law as an extension of the conflict happening in the trenches. It is also worth remembering that the trench gun story is a reminder of how ordinary tools and technology can be transformed by the demands of war. The Model 1897 was never designed with trench warfare or jungle combat in mind. It was a hunting weapon, built for shooting birds and small game in the countryside of early 20th century America. Yet the specific mechanical characteristics of the weapon, its ability to be slam-fired for rapid follow-up shots, and the widespread pattern of buckshot ammunition made it almost perfectly suited to the brutal, close-range conditions of both trench warfare in 1918 and jungle and cave fighting in the Pacific during the 1940s. This is a pattern we see again and again throughout military history, where civilian technology, adapted only slightly, ends up playing a significant role on the battlefield. The legacy of the trench gun did not end with the Second World War either. Combat shotguns based on very similar principles continued to be used by American forces in later conflicts, including Korea and Vietnam. And modern combat shotguns used by military and police forces around the world today still draw on many of the same design principles first proven effective by weapons like the Winchester Model 1897 more than a century ago. The specific controversy over whether the weapon violated the laws of war has never resurfaced in a serious way since 1918. Largely because the legal position established at that time has remained the accepted standard ever since. I think this story also asks us to consider something a little deeper about how we judge weapons in warfare in general. Every weapon used in war is designed to kill or incapacitate another human being, and it can feel strange to draw a firm legal line between what counts as an acceptable weapon and what counts as a war crime. The distinction between a bullet that expands on impact and a shotgun shell that spreads multiple pellets might seem, to many people, like a fairly narrow legal technicality rather than a meaningful moral difference. Yet these are exactly the kinds of decisions that shaped how both world wars were fought, and they continue to shape the rules of modern warfare today. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you, because this is exactly the kind of topic where I think different people are going to have genuinely different opinions. Do you think Germany's argument in 1918 had a legitimate legal or moral point, given that shotgun wounds caused by multiple pellets really can be more severe than a single rifle bullet wound? Or do you think this was simply a strategic move by a nation looking for any excuse to remove an effective weapon from their opponent's hands, with the moral argument really just being a convenient justification? I would also love to know what you think about the idea of banning certain weapons in war altogether. Where do you think the line should be drawn between an acceptable weapon of war and something that should be considered illegal or excessively cruel? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, because I always read through them, and some of the best discussions on this channel happen right there in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the more overlooked controversies of both world wars, please consider subscribing to WW2 Hero Cypher for more stories like this one. We cover the real history behind the weapons, soldiers, and the decisions that shape the outcome of these two enormous conflicts, always based on documented history and first-hand accounts rather than exaggeration. If you found this video interesting, a like helps us reach more people who care about accurate military history, and leaving a comment with your thoughts genuinely helps this channel grow. Thank you so much for watching all the way through, and we will see you in the next one.